I bring a book with me, one of my favorite academic books, by one of my teachers, John Levinson, The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, the Transformation of Child Sacrifice in Judaism and Christianity. I bring this book for support to make an observation about a very strange passage in the Torah. It comes up in Exodus 22. The Israelites have escaped from Egypt, they've crossed the sea, the Ten Commandments have been thundered down, and now there are more laws, and it's easy to get lost in these things. But let me read to you. It's from the New King James Version, just for fun. You shall not, I pick up in verse 28 of chapter 22. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall not throw it to the dogs. And on it goes. Now, what was that thing about giving the firstborn child, the firstborn son? You shall give to me, says the Lord. And then, lest you just think this is some kind of vague or abstract thing, it seems, the law goes on to say, likewise, in the same way, you will do with your oxen and your sheep. 7 days with the mother, 8th day to me. Like, what is that supposed to mean in terms of a human being? Like, is the text here talking about, like, where do you give it? Do you take it to a temple? You wouldn't give it in sacrifice, right? Like, that would be totally outlandish, the idea of a child sacrifice. Well, this language of child sacrifice actually is strangely, disturbingly, powerfully embedded into the Torah itself, indeed into the Hebrew Bible, and even beyond, historically. For example, already in Genesis, chapter 21, 22, Abraham has the sons, has Isaac, and after a while, God tests Abraham and tells him to sacrifice Isaac. A child sacrifice. Seems so bizarre, and people have had a tendency to psychologize Abraham, either the struggle that he would go through or calling him insane, like how could he make such a decision, and so on. It may be, though, that a look at the ancient context of child sacrifice could make a command like that to sacrifice a child and the willingness of Abraham to do it seem, even if not comfortable, something that at least has a context, a precedent. Namely, this idea that, yes, child sacrifice was a known religious practice in the ancient world. There's debate about when and where and why it occurred, but there are examples of this in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. Like, for example, not only do you have this command to Abraham, and not only do you have this odd verse that I just read in the book of Exodus, chapter 22, but you also have this very odd story in 2 Kings chapter 3, where a foreign king offers his firstborn child on the city walls as a sacrifice in order to win a battle. The text seems to indicate very strictly that it works, and that there's some wrath that comes against some external force that comes against the army, the Israelites, and they have to go away. They lose. In fact, as Professor Levinson points out in very poignant ways in this book, Christianity has a child sacrifice metaphor at the center of its salvific story, namely the idea that God offers someone who in the Trinitarian language is his son to death on a cross. It's hard to avoid the idea that that is child sacrifice language. In both cases, though, in the Akedah, Genesis 22, that's the Jewish term for the chapter, the binding of Isaac, the child is asked for to be sacrificed, but given back to the parent, to the father. So too in Christianity, Jesus is given away to death, but is given back in resurrection. This is a fascinating motif, right? We may even have some evidence from the ancient world that other groups like the Phoenicians also sacrificed children in crisis situations. We even have, very disturbing, in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 20, we have this wild reference in verse 25. I mean, Ezekiel says lots of strange things, but he says, speaking for the Lord, he's talking about the Israelites, how they've sinned and done all these terrible things. And he says, this is verse 25 of chapter 20 of Ezekiel, "Therefore I gave them up to statutes, to laws, to rules that were not good, and judgments by which they could not live. And I pronounced them unclean because of their ritual gifts, in that they caused all their firstborn to pass through the fire, that I might make them desolate, and that they might know that I am the Lord. That's kind of harrowing. A child sacrifice imagery, this imagery of having a child pass through the fire, is referred to elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible as a child sacrifice practice, something that the Lord forbids. Here Ezekiel seems to be saying that it was actually a command that God had given Israel that was not good, that God gave them in order to defile them somehow, or in order to lead them into some kind of problematic situation by which they then might somehow then know that the Lord is God. Very, very strange, isn't it? I bring these things up not merely to trouble your minds, but in order to focus your attention back on this passage in Exodus. Firstborn child belongs to me. Of course, in Exodus, you have another shade of meaning on this idea of the firstborn sacrifice, in that in the Passover, right, the Hebrew slaves who have fled Egypt are now putting blood on their doors, a kind of a substitute sacrifice, you could say. The angel of death passes by, but the firstborn of the Egyptian families, every firstborn is killed. So here again, you have a child sacrifice or a firstborn being given over to death kind of image. What a hard image to think about for those parents who have lost children at any age or in miscarriage, right? To think about, or any parent or anyone who could imagine having a child, or anyone that you even love, giving that thing up. I mean, this explains maybe the kind of primal importance and terror of an image like child sacrifice. It's giving up anything that you would consider important, everything that you would consider important, and giving it away, giving it to the Lord as a kind of ultimate gift. What more ultimate gift could a person give? In this book, John Levinson says these images of child sacrifice and the way that they're used show that maybe even if child sacrifice wasn't something that was frequently practiced literally, it survived as an idea. It survived as a notion. It survived as an ideal, as a sort of symbolic pattern that you can see played out in the Old Testament, even in other narratives, where there's a threat to the child and the child is given back. I think of stories in the Elijah and Elisha narratives in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, where an only child dies, but then is revived by the prophet, right? So there you see that motif actually at play, a child dying and a child being given back. Levinson puts Christianity and Judaism in dialogue on this point, right? And he actually ends the book with a kind of a stunning metaphor, a stunning conclusion. Often it's thought, Levinson says, that we would think of Judaism as the parent of Christianity, right? The Old Testament is like the parent, and then the kind of other religion comes along and uses it. He says, though, in the very closing of the book, poignantly, he says, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, usually characterized as one of parent and child, is better seen as a rivalry of two siblings for their father's unique blessing. Both share this common trope of the sacrifice of the child. Both take it in very different directions, and there's no attempt by Levinson, nor do I think, for me as a Christian, should there be any attempt to make the two traditions too similar, but nor would we want to make them too different. They share this common metaphor, and of course they share the Abrahamic heritage, right, in that story. They take it in very different directions, of course. Non-Christian Jews would of course not accept Jesus as being God's son and dying and being resurrected for the salvation of the world in the way that Christians do, certainly. But both of these stories encode something of this child sacrifice motif, however you take it. You have to acknowledge that it's a serious motif and that it's one that can't easily be ignored in the Torah.